Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's episode of the Cornerstone Press podcast. I am your host, Claire Haneke, and today we are going to be talking about editing poetry, specifically in regards to Margaret Rozga's book, Holding My Selves Together, which is going to come out in May of 2021. And today we will be joined by Kala and Seth, two of our editors on the press, to talk about editing. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. This week we have Kala and Seth with us, and we are going to be talking about editing poetry. So if you two want to introduce yourselves, let's start out with Kala.
Awesome. Yeah. I'm Kala Buttke. I'm the managing editor at the Cornerstone Press this semester.
And Seth.
And I'm Seth Barnes. I am a content editor who works for Kala at Cornerstone Press this semester and last semester.
Yeah. So, Kala, is this your first semester with the Cornerstone Press?
You could say technically I have been kind of doing summer work for the press since I started at UWSP actually in 2019. So I was a kind of a technical intern that summer, and then last summer I did a little bit of kind of copy editing, content editing work. But this is my first semester like in the class, fully involved. So
well, we're very happy to have you on the podcast and very happy to have you in the press, both of you. So first, I just want to talk about what have you been doing recently in the press? I know you've been working on Margaret Rozga's poetry book, so how has that been going?
It's been really good. She's a wonderful writer, so it's easy to kind of work through her already really excellent poems and kind of chat with her. I was able to sit in on one meeting with her where we kind of discussed a little bit of content editing with our managing editor or our editor-in-chief, Gabby. So that was really fun.
Yeah, on the content, I've also been working on that this semester. Just sort of being on the content editing team. There's not as much opportunity to talk directly with the author, but it's still a really cool experience to get to sit down, like with the actual manuscript, just be a part of working on something that like isn't in its final form yet. It's really cool to like kind of feel, I don't know, almost to like see my own hand in the finished product.
Absolutely. And with editing poetry, Seth, I know you've worked on Responsible Adults and Ohio Amateurs, and Kala, I'm assuming you've worked a little bit on Responsible Adults in the summer, correct?
A little bit, yeah.
A little bit. So both of those are prose. And how is poetry different? I would imagine it's a lot more difficult to edit that than it is to edit prose.
The main like glaring difference, I guess you could say, is that working on poetry, the poem can be anything, and it's kind of hard to look at it with like a critical eye and sort of try to like suss out what the author was maybe like going for versus what they ended up with, and like how you can improve that. I don't envy the copy editors though, working on poetry. That seems significantly more difficult just because punctuation just kind of goes right out the window as soon as you sit down to write a poem, at least in my experience. And then with prose, you just kind of, I think there's just a little bit more convention to lean on in terms of just like how a paragraph flows into an entire page, into an entire chapter or short story, or just kind of like, there's just a little bit more convention to be thinking about and to have in your back pocket.
So how do you guys deal with that? Like when you find something and you're like, I don't really know if this works. How do you determine whether or not it works in the poem or not versus how you make those same decisions when editing prose?
I think a lot of the times, I suppose in the more managing editor-in-chief angle, since we're able to kind of talk to her a little more directly than the rest of the team, it's good to kind of figure out her, in this case, like Margaret, her style, and kind of really pay attention to her themes and how she uses punctuation usually, I guess. Because speaking to the copy editor side, I was going to say you kind of really have to almost throw away most of your technical kind of experience with poetry because it's so deliberate every like period, whether it's even there or not. is really intentional. So I think really paying attention to what they do and what they don't do, I suppose. Like, how many M dashes does she use in this one, and why? Is it like a double hyphen in a different poem instead? Like, did she mean to put an M dash or something like that?
Yeah, punctuation is so tricky in general. I know back when we were working on Responsible Adults, Patty really likes to use like shorter sentences and stuff. And I remember that being like a conversation that all of the editors had to have with her. In terms of like the content of poems and word choice and what is actually like going on, how do you help the author like pin down what exactly they're trying to say and how to best communicate that?
In terms of poetry, you said?
Yes.
I don't know. This is definitely the theater major in me talking right now. But I think I really just try to like go with my gut a lot of the time. You know, you just kind of like sort of like what Kala's talking about, where you kind of just have to move away from like your own like technical writing knowledge, and you just really kind of have I don't know, like just sort of like follow your heart in that respect. I think you really just have to like just kind of read it out loud to yourself and see if you find it compelling, and if you have an idea for how it could be more compelling, or how it could be compelling in a different, perhaps more effective way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I'd say, again, you're kind of throwing away a little bit of the technical stuff, and poetry can really often be kind of like a verbal experience too. So it's helpful to kind of read through things out loud sometimes and see how it all flows together. If you stumble in a way that you think maybe this word could be different, or kind of get like it is kind of gut and kind of touch and go with your feeling too, of feeling like this stanza really effectively like captures the energy of this poem. However, like a stanza like later on kind of feels like it moves away from the main theme of the poem maybe, or the main emotion that the writer is trying to convey.
Another thing that I've also found really interesting that like I never really anticipated having to like put serious thought in for some reason, was just kind of like finding the relationship between the content of the poem and the way it's literally like formatted on a page is just really something I never had even like considered before working for the press, and like having to sit down and like offer feedback on that is something that never occurred to me. But like there's like a really interesting relationship just between the way the poem actually like looks, like what shape the words are in, and how things are like indented sometimes on like opposite sides of the page, and you're almost like it's like a little mystery trying to figure out how you're even supposed to read it, and that informs what you actually take away from the text, which I always find super cool.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge difference between poetry and prose is the visual aspect, both the verbal and the visual aspect of poetry versus prose, where
Mm-hmm.
prose overall seems to be more of like a mental experience, where poetry I think could be, depending on the type of poem, it can be like a physical experience, a visual experience, mental experience, or all of the above. So I think for me, as someone who doesn't actually partake in the editing in the Cornerstone Press, I can't imagine how you sit down and start to look at a poem and be like, I don't know if this works. So would you say that like analyzing the poem comes first and like figuring out what it's actually supposed to be about, and then you try to like make suggestions for how it can more effectively communicate that? Or is that something that comes later?
I think that can definitely be a really important part of it. Definitely like the initial read through, I usually kind of go for like what strikes me the most out of each one, and like the emotional impact. If I have a few favorites, I'm like, why do I like these the most? And like, or why do these kind of stand out as some of the strongest themes or emotions that the writer is able to do, and then how can I kind of try to bring that into other pieces or look at how other pieces could be stronger emotionally and that kind of thing. Yeah, I'd say kind of analyzing the way it makes you feel and all that is.
I usually find myself analyzing in the sense of like in an initial read through, like looking for like the large glaring, I guess, like signposts or like just like major themes that are at play of things that I feel like I'm very clearly supposed to be picking up on. And sort of like, I'm just always kind of like almost like looking for a narrative within the collection of poems, which isn't necessarily like, I don't know if that's necessarily like ever the goal. I'm it sometimes is. That's always something that I'm looking for. That I'm always also on the lookout for just like really cool lines or stanzas, and I'll always write that in. Like, dude, this was such a cool line. I'm super into it. And then it's sort of like gets more into what Kala was just talking about, of like just really trying to dig into it beyond things like cool lines and the larger signposts.
So, in terms of the comments that you make on the poems when you're editing them, do they tend to be all suggestions about like, what if you do this? What if you do this? Or is it reactions to certain lines? Like, this made me think of this. I really liked this. I know Patty really liked when Colin formed all of his like notes in the forms of questions. So, is there a certain type of feedback that you typically provide specifically with Margaret Rozga's book?
I'd say a healthy mix of both is really good. I think she really responded well to knowing what worked, and I think on every manuscript in general, you want to offer a few compliments of what is working, because that kind of encourages them, and maybe if some of the changes that you suggest aren't their like ideal thing, then they know what you think is working at least. I think Peggy responded pretty well to posing it as questions, or it's usually honestly suggestions most of the time, though. You want to be kind of gentle with tearing their poem apart, I suppose. So,
yeah, I usually, a lot of my notes and comments are usually either like, dude, this was an awesome line, or it'll be something more to the effect of like this is my understanding of like what's going on here in this poem or in this passage. Is that like, am I on the right track here? Like, is that like, are we jiving? Is that the kind of thing that like you want like your typical reader to be coming away with? Because that's kind of like where I'm at right now.
that's definitely something I do too. You want to tell them how you're interpreting the poem and the emotional impact you're taking away, because it might end up that that's not what they wanted at all, and that's a great place to kind of work on why that happened, and maybe it was the word choice, or like the structure of the poem even can make you feel a certain way. So
yeah, the more this might not be it, but the more time I spend working for Cornerstone as a content editor, the more I almost feel like more like a part of like a focus group, or like part of like just like a writer's workshop kind of, where it's just like I'm here to just sort of like be honest about what my takeaway is from the thing and try to offer as much constructive criticism as I can, and sort of like also play the part of like your average reader, I guess. Because one of the things that like I had struggled with a little bit in initially working with the press was almost feeling like I'm just a college kid and we're working with these people who have had multiple books published, who are like so obviously better writers than me in like very concrete ways. And so one of the things that I found really helpful for that was just sort of like approaching the work in the sense of like, I'm just gonna come at it with the things that I know how to do, and the sort of like, and just not try to alter my initial reactions to any of the stuff that I have to like sit down and edit.
Yeah, and I think that that kind of perspective would be really useful as an author because the people who are going to be reading your book might not have the same like experience or like level of literary knowledge. And so you want to make sure that the book is accessible to everyone. So I think you say that you aren't that experienced as a writer, but you obviously still have some experience. I've excuse me. I've been in creative writing classes with you. Um, but like just having varying levels of like experience and knowledge of writing and literature, I think with the press is good because it gives a variety of feedback. I know we have a lot of different majors within the Cornerstone Press. I'm a comm major. Kala, I believe you're an English major, correct?
Yes.
And then Seth's an acting major. So right here, we already have like a huge diverse group. And I mean, Colin was a philosophy major. So I think that kind of perspective and diverse perspective really makes the Cornerstone Press unique. And I know that's something that I've found when I've been in writing classes is that when people just tell me their reactions, it can completely change what I was writing. Actually, Seth made a comment on one of my stories 2 years ago that completely changed the entire story for the better. So,
Wow.
yeah. And
Cool.
yeah. Give you a little compliment there. Um,
Thanks.
but yeah, so I think that that's something that's really unique about the Cornerstone Press in terms of like who we have as staff.
Sure.
So something that I'm curious about, we've talked a lot about the process of editing Margaret Rozga's book, but what is her book about for those of us, because it's not out yet, so everyone hasn't had the chance to read it. So can you give us a little like sneak peek about some of the themes that appear in the book, some of the style of poetry that appears in the book?
Yeah, I don't want to hopefully
No
butcher
major
the emotional
spoilers.
impact. Yeah, that too. No major spoilers, but I believe it's divided into 4 sections. I should know. I've been working with it all semester. I definitely know. The first one is a really lovely kind of retelling of Alice in Wonderland and kind of inserting Margaret's own kind of experiences with herself and her daughter, and specifically like marathon running into it. And I think it's a really, really creative, kind of introspective first dive into the collection. I think it's a great first section. The other ones kind of touch on, she has one kind of about her activism and her experience with protesting in the 60s and 70s, I believe, for a lot of civil rights, which is really a really powerful collection as well. And then she has another kind of more introspective one about, it really has themes of like community through gardening and kind of the impact of nature on her life, it seems. And the final collection is really another really close introspective look at herself, and I believe that one is a self-titled kind of holding myself together one, so that's a really another powerful kind of personal section.
Seth, is there anything that you want to say about the poems in general?
Kala kind of knocked it out of the park there. That was pretty comprehensive. I definitely, this was my first time like working with poetry on sort of like this scale. As you said, Claire, I had worked on Responsible Adults and Ohio Apertures prior to this, and those were both, like hard prose. And so, but I definitely enjoyed getting a chance to like work in like these 4 different like parts that Kala's talking about here. As I was talking about earlier with like sort of like looking for a narrative in like the poetry work, it definitely helped with that, just to like almost to like think of them as chapters as I was editing, and like just as being not entirely separate, but like just sort of like being a little bit more self-contained. That was something that I thought was really cool, and I think is like a kind of a pretty unique aspect of this book when I think about like other poetry collections that I've read.
So it's kind of like 4 mini collections within a collection.
Yeah.
All right. That's awesome. It gives people a lot of variety. So if you're interested in any of those sections, I highly recommend you check out the book when it premieres. So you mentioned, Kala, that several of the sections are very introspective, and I would imagine that that kind of personal writing is a lot more difficult to edit. I know I had this kind of conversation with Gavi when talking about Ohio Apertures, and like, how do you edit someone's like memoir? Like, you can't say this doesn't make sense because it happened. Did you run into the similar issues or challenges when editing those sections of Margaret's book?
Well, I'd say maybe a little bit. There were definitely, most of the time, I would end up asking questions about, like, is this about someone personal in your life or a really particular person in your life? I think there was one where she ended up explaining to me, I think it was about one of her, like, sister's kids or something that she was picturing, and I kind of interpreted it as herself, but she thought that was kind of a really cool angle, and she was open to it being kind of interpreted that way. So just things like that, kind of double checking a little bit whether it's like a personal experience and like how far you can go then in that and edit that kind of direct like line into her life and what she's talking about.
I think that also directly plays into what Kala had touched on earlier about just never, just like having like a solid rule of thumb is to just never be too harsh or about anything that you come across, just because it, like, you know, is really personal work, and it's like very closely, usually very, like, at least in the terms of something like Peggy's book, is usually very closely related to something like from their personal life. And so, you know, you never want to like come out swinging, like asking like really like personal questions, and B, like kind of being like hypercritical of the thing before like you have a really clear understanding of what it's in reference to. I feel like just like looking, like searching for intention in the writing over like what its actual source is something that like I've found really helpful. Is like just look for like what is their, like what is the objective with the piece, as opposed to like why are you writing it. I feel like the difference there is mainly semantic, but I think like it's still something that's like helped me.
I see that acting major terminology poking out there.
What is the goal? What is the objective? What does the character want?
I mean, truly, I bet that's a helpful thing to look at, especially when it's more character-driven pieces.
Mm-hmm.
We joke, but once again, going back to that varying perspectives.
Yeah.
So something that I'm always curious about is like specific pieces that undergo a lot of change with the Cornerstone Press. Is there a poem that you guys can think of off the top of your head that went through a lot of change over the editing process? And obviously not giving too much away, but can we talk a little bit about that?
I believe she actually added a whole new poem, kind of in the middle of, maybe the team didn't really catch it, but
she wrote news to this guy.
Yeah, she wrote and added a whole new one, and we're like, yeah, put that in there. It was kind of, she ended up cutting a couple short ones, I believe, and kind of inserting this new one to kind of better represent one of the sections, I believe. So that was, we didn't really have to edit that one much physically, but it was cool to kind of have her still be thinking of it as like a transformative, changing work and throwing new stuff at us, which was, it's really one of the greatest ones in there. So
Yeah, I know that similar changes happened, especially with Patty's book, in terms of stories being taken out, added, moved around. And I think a lot of the times people think of when you're editing a book, when it gets to the stage with the editors, you think, oh, it's kind of done. They just kind of like proofread it and everything. But both of you are smiling and shaking your heads. Like there's obviously so much work that goes into it after the manuscript is submitted. So something really cool about Margaret Rozga is that she is a former poet laureate for the state of Wisconsin, and we get to publish her book. So is that kind of intimidating when you go to edit her work?
Yeah. I mean, I think, at least for in my experience working on holding myself together, it kind of goes back to what I had touched on earlier of just being intimidated in general by like working with these authors who like have all these like awesome accolades, and just kind of, I don't know, trying to approach it with the things that I know how to do and trying to offer my unique perspective is really kind of like, it's like that's all I really got.
I think I set it aside a little bit while editing, but you can absolutely see why she was the poet laureate in the work. It definitely, all of it shines very strongly. So
something that I'm curious about, we've talked a little bit about your experiences, but do either of you write poetry? And if you do, does that influence how you come to the work as an editor, or just writing in general? Does that influence how you come to it as an editor?
I write a little bit of poetry. It's not my favorite genre personally for me to write in. I do a lot more prose and fiction work, but I think it definitely, I come at the process a little bit differently, I think, now that I have experience editing it. I try not to self-edit too much while I'm like in the creative process, because that can get a little rough, but yeah, I definitely am learning a lot from even reading works like these and kind of being able to talk with the author and then pulling that into how I think about my own work and like my own word choice, like why did I arrange it like this, or why did I use this specific word. So I think it's definitely influenced me a bit.
Yeah, I do a little bit of like songwriting is kind of like the closest thing I get to writing poetry. Just like in my regular kind of like everyday life, that's outside of like assigned classwork, because writing some poetry is something that usually comes up in your any given English class. And then, but the vast majority of like my writing experience is in playwriting, which is something that I'm like super passionate about. And that has like, I don't know how much it like helps me in terms of like editing poetry, but again, it just kind of goes back to this thing of like, that is my perspective, and like it's kind of what I got to offer. And that's kind of, I think, what always has me looking for like narratives, even in something like poetry collections, just because like writing a play is so it is the narrative, like all it, like everything is built around this like story arc and like the idea of a character changing. And that's always something that I'm looking for just out of habit in terms of projects like this. And so the first section of this, of holding myself together, is called like Alice Marathons. And I got so excited when I saw that. I was like, we have got a character name, ladies and gentlemen. There is a person going on a marathon journey throughout this section, and we are going to find a character arc for Al. I was so excited. I loved working on that.
I would imagine another similarity between playwriting and poetry is word choice and
Yeah.
conciseness. I haven't done a lot of playwriting, but I've done some screenwriting, and I know in that, like, you have to
Mhm.
find like the fewest amount of words as possible. And
Right.
poetry is also like very compact. So would you say that that kind of is like a similar theme in
Yeah,
poetry?
definitely. Um, I mean, one of the things that's always just drawn me to playwriting in general is just the fact that like when I'm reading like a book, I'm outing myself here. When I'm reading a book, I always just jump to the dialogue. Like I will skip chunks of prose in like my own reading time, just so that I can hear what the characters are saying. And so what draws me to playwriting in that respect is like it's all dialogue. And so then I get to read the whole thing. But yeah, I think in terms of like that kind of word choice, it's almost like you have to like the word choice is specific to the character. Like you have to understand who the character is before you can like write dialogue for them, and then the dialogue informs the character and the character keeps informing the dialogue, and it's soup. And that's just a process that I find incredible. But when I'm looking at like editing these poems, it's almost like figuring out who the speaker is of this poem, like who is telling me this poem, and figuring out who that character is. And then that starts to inform like decisions and alterations that could be made to the poem. Or honestly, it just kind of like enriches my own experience of like reading it and makes it make more sense to me. So you're absolutely right, Claire, that is like a super helpful thing.
Awesome. So, is there anything else, just general, about Margaret's book that you have really enjoyed working on, or any challenges? Any final thoughts on Margaret's book?
She's a wonderful, wonderful person to work with. I can definitely say that much. As Professor Tangerdahl likes to say, it's the kind of Midwestern Wisconsin charm, and she's got it for sure.
I definitely am glad that I got to work with someone who like is a Wisconsin-based writer. I guess I don't know if she's like from Wisconsin or not. Like the Wisconsin in her writing is like clear, and it no, it makes me like really happy to get to read and work on the work of someone from Wisconsin, just because like so much like I don't know. I feel like whenever I sit down and like learn about a poet or read some poetry from someone, they're just like, the hills of Vermont are so beautiful. And it just like, it's always about the hills of Vermont. And then I get to read something by Peggy here, and it just makes me, I don't know, it makes me feel known, brings me joy.
Yeah, I think that's something really great about Cornerstone is that we are like giving a voice to Midwestern writers who, as you said, like a lot of times it's the Northeast that gets the most
Yeah.
attention, which is fair. The Northeast is beautiful, but the Midwest also is
Yeah,
amazing.
it's not so bad.
So I have one final question for you guys, just in general about your experiences with Cornerstone Press and what has it done for you as a student, as a writer, as an editor? What do you enjoy about it? Why would you recommend people join the press?
I initially didn't go to UWSP. I started in Duluth, and I came back for a number of reasons, but really mostly for the fact of the opportunity that the press offered, and the fact that we're one of the few in the country that even offers this experience like for students to work on is really, really amazing. And I feel really lucky to even be a part of it, be like in a position on the team. I would like to be an editor when I graduate, so it's really phenomenal work to be able to get this direct experience while I'm still in college even. So
Yeah, on my end, up until working with the press, I had always had like kind of these aspirations of being a writer, whether that was like, you know, writing books, writing plays, what have you. But I really had like no concept of what went into making a book. Like I knew that like you had to take it to a publisher, and I knew that there was an editor somewhere in the publishing house. I had all the puzzle pieces, but I had no idea what the process of putting them all together was like. And just sort of getting a peek behind that curtain and just kind of seeing how the sausage gets made has been super, just like awesome. Like I never would have gotten that experience like anywhere else. I can't even imagine trying to get anything published without that knowledge now. I think back on being like a sophomore and not having any of that experience with Cornerstone, and like going forward and not getting it. Like I just would have like, I feel like I would have like crashed and burned immediately, just like without just sort of like the knowledge of like the inner workings of a publishing house. Like I'm just so glad I know that now.
It's definitely a demystifying experience. And I
Yeah,
think for me, the biggest thing that it's opened my eyes to is how collaborative bookmaking
for
is,
sure.
and how, in many ways, it could be much more like a film production in terms of the amount of work that goes into it. I think
Mhm.
the author still is like more authoritative than, let's say, a director, but still, it's a very collaborative process that I don't think people really think about. And one of my goals in this podcast is to really kind of show like these are the people that help make the books, and that
Yeah,
there's so much more into bookmaking than just a writer sitting down and writing in a notebook. Very introspective. It's a very social
yeah.
experience.
I think one of my favorite things to do, just sort of like with the press, is like the day, like we have like, little like town hall meeting days in class with uh with Professor Tangadal. And we just get to see what everybody else has been working on. And I've only worked as a content editor for the press, but like I just kind of sit in my room and I read the manuscript and I just sort of type away on my little keyboard, and then I get to come back into class like once a month or so, and like you kind of like see everything else that's going into the thing that you're working on, and it immediately, like in an instant, it goes from being like a Word document that I am like looking at and just have a deadline for, to being like a book. Like you see the covers and you like hear from the marketing folks about like they're buying copies of the book. It's awesome. I love it.
Thank you both so much for coming on today. It was really fun talking to both of you and just getting to hear this perspective. I think it'll be really interesting for people to listen to. So once again, thank you once again to Kala and to Seth for coming and joining me on this episode of Cornerstone Podcast. And unless there's anything else that you two would like to say, I think we can go ahead and sign off.
No, this has been awesome.
All
Thank
right.
you very much. It was
Yeah.
a blast.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right. I will talk to you all later then. I want to thank Seth and Kala once again for joining me on the podcast today. It was so wonderful to hear what you had to say and to just talk with you about this amazing book that we're going to be putting out. Margaret Rozga's Holding Myself Together is available for pre-order right now, and you can order directly from us at our website, uwsp.edu/english/cornerstone/pages/books.aspx. And if you want to order our books directly from us, which is the best way to support the press and to support our authors, I highly recommend you go there, pre-order our book Holding Myself Together by Margaret Rozga, and then also look into our other titles. Ohio Apertures is out, and now you can read Robert's book, and Responsible Adults by Patricia Ann McNair. Those are our two most recent titles, and once again, you can get them at uwsp.edu/english/cornerstone/pages/books.aspx. Thank you once again for listening. I'm Claire, and I will see you next month.